Okay, so welcome back to week 8. We have this week and 2 more weeks left. What I wanted to try to do today was a little bit of a, I guess I could call it a transition. I don't know if that's the right word for it. The couple chapters in the book are dealing with Moreland putting into practice how to think about reality, how to think about the world around you. Okay, and I eat that stuff up so I could get really into those chapters and have great fun with them. But they are not the primary goal of what we were trying to do with the class. And so unless you have something you want to get into, if there was, and I realize that this is a Pandora's box question because there's a lot of sciencey stuff in those chapters, and it may or may not, it may either be your cup of tea or not your cup of tea, one or the other. So, but if there are questions on those chapters, they are really well done. I've read this series of arguments from many different sources, and Moreland does a really good job with it. So he sort of split the difference between looking at it theologically or philosophically and science-y. Science-ly. I don't know how to say that. Anyway, not talking well today. What I wanted to try to do, and this is the transition part, and Bill has been poking at this for a number of weeks, and so maybe we can at least begin to poke at it. In a sense, to deal with this statement, how then should we live? What is the impact of all of this stuff that we've been talking about? Okay, if we go back and sort of look at big milestones of what we've tried to get across, is that learning is a universal condition. We all learn. Okay, we may learn poorly, we may learn mediocrity. Why do I keep making it words I can't say? Or we may learn well, but learning is always going on. Okay, that learning is the way in which the capacities of the soul are developed. Okay, so the capacities are part of the model. They are the imago Dei part of us. They come with us. God created them. But they need to be developed, and that's what learning is about. And there's many kinds of learning. Academic is one of the ways of learning. In our modern culture, and probably throughout a great deal of the history of human beings, some form of education has played a significant role in the learning process. And so as we looked at learning, we sort of, the flip side of learning was to look at education a little bit, and some of our articles have been along those lines. And we've sort of poked at that issue a little bit. So what? See, I'm trying to ask this question that students see so often in their quizzes to myself. What does this mean to education? But even more significantly, are there things involved in all of this that we've been talking about for a number of weeks that can apply to the church? And that's what we want to try to poke at a bit. We've got a few weeks. The very last chapter of the book, Moreland gets into that. In the older edition, the very first edition of this book, actually he got into it, he'd be in it now. He dealt with this issue from several different angles in several chapters. In this edition, it's reflective of the times in which we're in. in that not only did he felt that he needed to demonstrate how thinking is done, but he needed to deal with the issue which has become an issue of doubt, strangely enough, in a lot of people's minds, that it's only a matter of faith that there is a God, and faith is something I don't have any evidence to support. And there isn't any way that you can come at the issue of thinking about God with reasoning. And we have bought the separation of the two, and we talked about this a number of weeks ago, that they're not separate. God, they're both thinking. They are two different kinds of thinking designed to work together. Okay. And those are all tangents that we could spend all kinds of time on. They're almost like whole other classes all unto themselves. We'll use these articles as just sort of a very mild diving board. You may agree or you may disagree, particularly the second one. Christianity Today has good articles, but sometimes I don't always agree with them. But so it is, the purpose of both of these is a diving board. And then we'll dive first of all into education so that we can play around with what are the implications of what we've been talking about and how education maybe should work. And then we'll try to draw from that discussion, which may be today and it may go on into next week, in what we can really learn in the church. So we're going to have sort of a 3-week landing pattern here. Moreland has taken it down to 1 chapter, but in his original book he actually had several chapters on this kind of idea. What do you do with all of this stuff? And so that's what we're about. I am not in any way going to try to present that I have all the answers to this. I don't. I've spent a long time thinking about it and trying and experimenting and doing stuff. And it's a challenging issue both in education and in the church to sort out. But I think that we have at least a few tools to help us do that sorting from ideas that come from Moreland's book. And so let's see what we can come up with. Okay, first of all, let's go ahead and launch into the article. Eliana, why don't you go ahead and start for us, and the choosing excellence over equitable mediocrity. Okay, and go the first 4 paragraphs down to final grade.
If you, like me, were a student who strove to get work in on time and took advantage of extra credit or other academic perks when offered, then you can be glad you're past school age, especially if you live in Portland or Oregon. Yeah. That's because schools in that district are beginning to implement equitable grading practices. Just what does equitable grading entail? According to a handout from Portland's public school system, equitable grading includes such practices as no scores of 0, provide a minimum grade greater than or equal to 50% for work that does not meet expectations, is incomplete, or is missing, the handout reads. No academic consequences for cheating. Provide alternative consequences to cheating instead of zeros. Let the kids turn in work when they feel like it. Do not penalize students for submitting late work. Lower the incentive for studying outside the classroom. Do not grade homework and/or do not include homework as part of a final grade.
Okay. Okay, and then 1, 2, 3. Jake and 3.
Ending with that big one?
And yes, the with doesn't it is at the end of it. Okay.
I always find it fascinating when life today plays out very similarly to something predicted by a great thinker decades earlier. Although this happens quite often, I couldn't help but be amazed upon reading these new equitable grading guidelines out of Oregon. For it's as if they were lifted out of C.S. Lewis's 1959 essay, Screwtape Proposes a Toast. For those unfamiliar with Lewis's Screwtape letters, Screwtape is a demonic character always seeking to find devious ways to
Thwart
God's plans and purposes for his creatures on earth. Thus, Screwtape's advice is usually the opposite of what rational, truth-loving individuals should seek to do. This is especially true with regards to education. According to Screwtape, democratic education can be very useful to his
Diabolical.
diabolical purposes. The basic principle of the new education is to be that
Dunces.
dunces and idlers must not be made to feel inferior to intelligent and industrious pupils. That would be undemocratic. Screwtape says, thus, these differences between pupils, for they are obviously and nakedly individual differences, must be disguised. This can be done at both the university level and earlier by enabling nearly all the students to get good marks. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Okay, next 3.
In the same way, there must be no faintest hint that children who don't work as hard in school are inferior to the children who are at work. Whatever nonsense they are engaged in must have, I believe the English already use the phrase parity of esteem, Screwtape explains. Such a practice, he goes on to say, boils down to the concept of I'm as good as you. And the purpose behind I'm as good as you, Screwtape reveals, is the destruction of true education. In a word, we may reasonably hope for the virtual abolition of education when I'm as good as you has fully had its way. All incentives to learn and all penalties for not learning will be prevented. Who are they to overtop their fellows? And anyway, the teachers, or should I say nurses, will be far too busy reassuring the dunces and patting them on the back to waste any time on real teaching. We shall no longer have to plan and toil to spread impenetrable conceit and incurable ignorance among men. The little vermin themselves will do it for us.
Okay. Chuck, why don't you just go ahead and finish this thing off?
Okay. Why, the question naturally arises, would the devil be so intent on destroying true education? The simple answer is that good education creates good societies and great men, while bad or democratic, equitable education destroys them, turning those who are trained under this form of equity against all that's good, true, and beautiful in this world. I'm as good as you is a useful means for the destruction of democratic societies, but it has a far deeper value as an end in itself, as a state of mind which necessarily excludes humility, charity, contentment, and all the pleasures of gratitude or admiration, turns a human being away from almost every road which might finally lead him to heaven. The last few years since COVID have been remarkable shakeups in our world, and many of these are playing out in the education sector. For some, those shakeups mean their eyes have been opened and they're seeking better alternative forms of education for their children. For others, it just means their children are stuck in public systems which increasingly promote the I'm as good as you concept through things such as equitable grading and other watered down curricula. So, how do we get away from such a situation? According to Screwtape, these things happen when education moves away from parental and private options and toward full state control. Thus, any stepping stones that can get our children away from said state control and toward more parental choice and educational freedom are a win. In brief, it's time to start choosing excellence, not equitable mediocrity.
Okay. This is Annie Holmquist. This comes from Intellectual Takeout, which is just a conglomeration of all kinds of articles from all kinds of people. She writes on a lot of things, but she focuses on education. So you go to their website and look her up, and you can find a wealth of articles on education. Now, your first thoughts in looking at this article. First, something either that jumps out at you, or maybe a little harder to do, connections between this article and some of the stuff we've been reading in Moreland.
Gives me hope for 40 years from now.
Okay, good. What do you mean?
Because, as he points out, a lot of people are making the choice to make sure that their children get a good, high-quality education. And you mix that with a bunch of people who are receiving this kind of equitable education, and in 40 years, those who have received a good education will be the ones that are prepared and ready to be the leaders of our society and culture. Because the people going through this, they are nothing more than just wards of the state. You see what I mean? It's a waiting game. But they're not going to know how to lead, they're not going to know how to govern, they're not going to know how to be able to handle the responsibilities that the real world needs to function properly. And so it's a waiting game.
Now, I'm probably off topic here and out of school, but I read this, and it's good, but it's talking about having a good education and not really talking about learning, as far as I can tell. And is there a difference? Apparently there may be. Having a good education is you get the right marks, you put in the time, you do the assignments, but a year later you probably didn't learn anything in that class. You know? And I see learning as a whole broader spectrum
Much
that
bigger.
we've talked about.
Right.
And I don't want to sell things short by saying, let's be satisfied with education.
Right.
Right. What I think what happens there, they're not looking at content or what's actually being delivered, but there's also a fundamental element of hard work, carrying responsibility, basically doing what needs to be done in the situation that you find yourself in, rather than I don't want to do anything, I'm going to go do what I want all the time. And it's so even if they're not technically learning how to think or receiving the full type of education that we'd like them to have, they're just the functional element that this is talking about and kind of was alluded to here is still teaching something incredibly important, which is responsibility and diligence.
It's important. I just see a bunch of people saying they're satisfied with following Jordan Peterson rather than actually having their life changed.
Right.
You know?
And okay, let me come at several things. First of all, in all fairness to this author, you'd have to read a whole bunch of her articles
Right.
to get it. And she
so
would
we've
probably
taken this in
be,
isolation.
yeah, she would probably be more broadly in agreement with what you're saying. I don't know that she would be exactly there, but she would be more broadly in agreement. Okay. Next, just keep in mind that, as you're pointing out, learning is a word that applies broadly. Okay. What we're confronting is that learning and education have become almost equivalent to each other. And so, in a sense, I'm sort of through the back door poking at that issue. Because I don't think that's necessarily the case, and something that we need to be clear, particularly when we try to apply it more broadly. Okay, third, just as a footnote, probably in these discussions, I will be a poking agent. Okay, don't necessarily conclude that it's what I actually think. Okay, so just so you know that.
Good.
Okay, let me jump to an example of what I think she's trying to get across. And I have no idea if she would even agree with this or not. It's just something that went through my head as I read it. Okay, spent most of my life in California. We could equate California as a very nice government state. It's pretty much the government runs most things. So to be in a private school, to be in a Christian school, to be in a classical Christian school, you are an anomaly, period. Okay. Now that does not say that everything that went on was bad. In fact, in many ways, it was really quite organized in the past. It's falling apart now, but in the past it has been. Now, one of the things that I loved when we moved to Texas was I love what was just isolated little pockets of entrepreneurial spirit in California. It's all over the place here in Texas. Now I realize that if you've been in Texas a long time, you probably feel like it's being crushed compared to what it used to be. I've thought about that quite a bit, but still, it is exciting. And two areas that I thought about that in is, first of all, much more so than anything you would see in California, is that people just decide, I think I'm going to launch a school. Okay. One side of that, I cheer on. Yeah, let's try. And I think our discussions will probably amplify that a little bit, kind of what I mean by that. On the other hand, I see people running forward that have not really, either do not understand or not taken the time to think about the cost that's going to have to be paid, not just money, but just the overall cost that's going to have to be paid to do that thing. It's just sort of like, education's just like breathing air. Okay, in other words, because we've equated learning, which is fairly universal, to education, then just anybody can do education. And you end up seeing a lot of schools, but very few, and now you can throw rocks at me, that's fine, excellent schools. I think you see a lot of mediocre schools. They're not bad. There's certain things they do that they're really pretty good. But overall, they're just mediocre. And we're having the tendency to accept that. Okay. One thing that happened in California, which living there was a frustration, but you didn't survive unless you were good. You got crushed. Okay, as I put it, the Empire built the Death Star, and they were going to zap you if you were a private little person, unless you ran really fast. Okay, you just had to really keep moving. You had to keep changing ideas. And over time, you might even see them copy some of the ideas you had, but they copied it like about a decade later, and then took about a decade to implement it. And by then, you're way number of ideas down the road. Okay. The other thing, this is probably more controversial and not necessarily what we're going to get to today, because I want to try to tend to stay on the education side. I've tended to see this more so here, way more here than in California, and that is, we launch churches like crazy here. There's churches everywhere. It's utterly astounding. I mean, in one part of me, again, cheers that on. That is cool. The other side of it goes, particularly as one who's surveyed a whole lot of them, is so many of them, they are good people, but they're just mediocre. Okay. So now, in a sense, not even necessarily Holmquist, but more C.S. Lewis. And to really get the impact of this, you sort of had to read Screwtape Letters, and then Screwtape Proposes a Toast is something he wrote years later, and then it tends to get stuck at the end of Screwtape Letters now. And it is, if Screwtape Letters was sarcastic, Screwtape Proposes a Toast is really sarcastic. He just really, I mean, he passed away a few years later. He was really grinding down on what is going on around us. Okay. And the issue revolves around this mediocrity excellence thing. Is it important for us to just do, even though it may come off mediocre? Or should we invest the effort, which it involves a whole lot of things, not just academic work, but the effort to produce excellence in whatever we do. And in this case, we're applying it to schools and to churches. Okay, so there's my poke. Respond. Agree, disagree. If you throw things, have them be a little bit soft. No hard rocks, okay? Just soft rocks. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just kind of wondering if a lot of people, anytime I mention it, people go, oh, if we believe that excellence means perfection, and there's a difference between perfection and excellence. We can strive for excellence all the time, but perfection will never reach.
Right.
And I wonder if people feel like, well, if I have to be perfect, I give up, you know?
Right. I think that's a very accurate observation. And two things over the years have influenced how I think about it, and I almost need to be reminded of that because it's, I think, very clear what you're saying. One is in the early days of my management years, when I was eventually in charge of the facilities for Biola University and had whole departments reporting to me and all this kind of stuff. It was the era of In Search of Excellence. And if you're familiar with that, I just thought they were onto a lot of really good stuff with that, and I digested all of it. And one of the things, there's so many things I could point out, but the In Search of Excellence and A Passion for Excellence, which I think was the book that followed it, they were so impactful that PBS actually produced 2 TV series, one for each book. And I remember on the second one, one of the main things they focused in on was, because it sort of blew the minds of the PBS people, is that what they discovered in the In Search of Excellence research, companies that were truly excellent, not just good, but excellent, and that you had to read a whole bunch to get exactly what they meant by that. They had a very specific way of thinking about that. They gave away all of their secrets. In fact, it was part of the culture of some of those companies to literally go out to their competitors and try to help them and train them. And some people would listen and some people wouldn't, but still, that was part of the culture of those companies. And PBS, I remember them just grilling Tom Peters, the guy who did the In Search of Excellence stuff. And he said, yeah, that surprised us too in our research. And so we really dug into that. And we talked to a lot of people. And the most common thing that came out of it was that we have to keep from becoming, and I'm editorializing, I'm adding words that they didn't put in. We have to keep from becoming inner focused. If we're solely focused on ourselves, it may be good for a while, but it won't be good forever. And that was a characteristic of excellent companies. They weren't just good for a moment in time. They were able to sustain it through ups and downs and all kinds of stuff. And that when you give something away, not only are you helping somebody else, that's a good thing, but you're helping yourself. Because not only does it cause you to understand the idea better, but he said, practically speaking, we're helping them with ideas that are brand new to them. We've already been doing it for a few years. And we're on to the next idea and the next idea and the next idea. So now if we got out into these ideas, now that might be a different discussion. We're still internally discussing what we mean by all of that and what will work. But as far as the mainstream of what's making us a good company, what people see and equate as a good company, we're giving it away. We're trying to help others. I see that attitude in schools, and again, one of the things I've done was been involved in school accreditations for 20 plus years, and that would have been interesting. The accreditation process didn't ask you to think about this, so I just sort of on the side thought about it. But most of the schools that that I went through the accreditation process, most of them were good schools that I would say were mediocre to mediocre plus. Okay. Normally my reaction was, this little dinky school in the middle of the desert that nobody knows about that I work at, I'm glad to come home because we do more things than we realized really well. There were a couple schools that I had the opportunity to get involved in the team with that where I would consider them to truly be excellent. And the culture there was radically different than at most schools. They were running seminars, they were training people, they were giving it away. And I remember it's sort of coming back, oh my goodness, this was years later, but that's the In Search of Excellence stuff. That's exactly what they're saying. They were excellent, and they worked hard at being excellent. They just didn't do one thing well. They did everything well. But when you looked at it, it was only just, of all the years of schools that I went on accreditation visits to, literally, I can say 2 that I would have considered excellent. There were a couple there in Southern California that I would have considered excellent, but I was not on an accreditation team to them. Chuck?
Now, kind of adding on to what she was talking about, the sense of paralysis that comes when you say, I have to be excellent. And I've been in organizations that did the In Search of Excellence stuff and all of that. But at some point, and maybe it was around the time open source software came about, people started saying, well, if something's really worth doing, it's worth doing poorly, if that's all you can do, And that ultimately went through Silicon Valley and came back as move fast and break things, in order to try new things, to get to some place that no one is excellent at because it's never been done before. And so that's the experimental, the discovery process, that's the entrepreneur and the explorer aspect of it all. The excellence companies tend to be staid. They almost become a commodity at some point because they've got a proven project that they've been doing, where anything that's new, you have to be willing to be bad at.
That's really an interesting point, and we could get off on the tangent on that very easily. It may be the best way to keep from, because I would love to get into that because there's a great deal of what I think I agree with there. Okay, and I'm trying to come up with something. Another big issue on the idea of excellence that has really helped me was captured in Philippians 4:8, and that is, think on these things. And then the word, that the Greek word there can be translated virtuous, and most older translations translate it that way. Most modern translations translate it excellence. And excellence in the term of virtue development, that I'm not there yet. I am not perfect, but the process I'm engaging in is involved in trying to develop that. And inevitably, I think back some of the early discussions that Bill and I had when I first started working for him. He probably got tired of it. Stories that I would tell that were, yep, I tried that. It failed. I messed it up. But I learned from it, and then we tried another thing, and we tried another thing. Most of the ideas that I was working with had tried something else, and it had not worked. And I sort of equate that to the rebellion empire thing in Star Wars. If, as a school, you are not willing to make mistakes and keep trying and not think of yourself as being perfect. So in a sense, sort of grabbing both of those ideas and putting them together, I think it's a key to developing. It's part of learning. We are fallen human beings. We are not perfect. Okay. But we can grow in virtue. We can develop the capacities that God has put us there. And he gives us a very clear picture, some of which we've seen in this book, of how that's done. That's that learning process. Okay, so now, what do we take from what we're talking about right now and apply it back to education or to schools? What are we saying here, do you think?
Not yet moving forward to that question, but when you first asked that question about excellence and the pursuit of excellence, the thing that I was thinking about, and even because I think you started with a question about we start lots of schools here and start lots of churches here, and you asked if is that a good thing? And the first thought that came to my mind is it's not about where they are at in this moment, but it's about the driving dream and vision. It's what are they pursuing? So when we talk about a school that has some level of excellence, right? We've got excellence, now we package it, now we can market it, and now it's no longer but moving forward. But the word you kept saying was, but we're already on to the next ideas. When somebody is driven by, we're trying to develop real virtue, real wisdom, real character, real thinking skills. We're trying to, we know, we kind of have an idea of what we would like to see developed, and then we try something and it's getting more success than what we were doing before, and then next thing you know, it's getting more success than what anybody else is doing. But instead of saying, look what we have done, let's package that for everyone, that driving motivation, which is why you kept trying new things, was how can we still produce better, more virtuous, more kind, compassionate, loving, intelligent, thoughtful, Christians, for example. And because that's the thing that's driving it, creativity kicks in. There's a constant tension between thanking God for the success we're having and a constant discontentment because we know there could be more. And so when those things are kind of together, it just keeps things moving forward in the right direction. But that's what I would look for in these churches. Do they have a passion, or these schools, for what they want to develop? Now, a lot of churches, this is one of my things that's been on my heart forever, is a lot of churches, their goal is to get people to heaven. That's it. It's to get people saved. And it's not to present people mature in Christ. It's not to reproduce the life of Christ in people. They give lip service to it, but that's not their driving motivation. And so it changes what all the creativity and drive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and equate that to schools too. We have lost view of what it was that schools were attempting to do for a very long time. They didn't always do it, but we lost view of that. Mm-hmm. And in losing view of that, we redefined what quote-unquote excellence would be. Excellence becomes the perfect curriculum. It becomes materials that are, they tell the teacher that it's okay to cough now and not okay to cough now. It just goes on and on and on. And to be really honest, you look at the materials, and they're well done. They're just not accomplishing the right goal. They're just, okay, now if we step back, we can start to parallel this in the church. It's a little harder, but we subtly we miss what it is that God intends the church to be. And this is where this gets to be. I'm waving out on the end of a limb right now. I realize probably most of this discussion I will be. But the church, to simplify mountains of church history into a few sentences, grasped that they were what Bill was talking about. They were trying to develop virtue in people. They were trying to prepare for eternity. They were trying to seek first the kingdom of God right now, not just maybe someday. And that they recognized they were not perfect people, but that they could be developed to become better. That's
fine. I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, most bestest. Prepared for the future. So now it becomes a matter of you start to slowly, subtly look at size and efficiency and quality of material and teachers that can put a bunch of pieces of paper on the wall to say that they're good. How do you know you're good? Look at the wall. The wall says I'm good. No.
It's a
Our
smart
kids
wall.
our kids learning, that's the only criteria, really. And we lose that perspective. I think that we've lost it in schools or in education, and we've lost it in the church. And it's so subtle because it doesn't mean that good things aren't happening. It's a very difficult discussion. It's easy to throw rocks initially, but then once you get really into the discussion, it isn't easy to throw rocks when you talk about public education. There's a lot of good stuff that goes on out there and a lot of good people working in it. Okay, but if you're aiming at the wrong target, the question you have to ask yourself is hitting that target producing excellence? If it's not, then you're hitting the wrong target. You just got to cough it up and change directions and go to a different target. And I think that's what probably in private education that's coming out right now. Christian education kind of gets that a little bit. Classical Christian gets it a little better, but we still succumb to the same thing. We equate excellence to the stuff we do, not the kind of people we produce. Classical and Christian education and classical Christian education both are concerned about the kind of person they develop, and that's, I think, why good things are happening there. But still, they're trying to run with flat tires.
They're trying to use the progressively developed methods to produce a classical outcome.
Right.
But that's the reason it's challenging. Because I was thinking about, you remember Dead Poet Society, right? And the first thing he does is he has them read out of that textbook, the introduction, and he says, okay, now everybody rip it out of your book. right? And then at the end, the guy, when he's put out, the teacher's reading that essay to them all. But this was the big problem. I called it the curriculum train. Teachers are trained to serve the curriculum train. But you can use that content, if that's all that's available, if you've gotten off the train, you can use it in a way that can actually develop what needs to be developed. You just have to be a little extra critical of it. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, but my point being is I think that we still, a lot of good people, even in classical schools, but they keep using progressive methods that were produced out of that system.
And just to parallel this, I think the same thing can be seen in churches. Okay, it's not that there aren't good people, there are. And it's not that good things aren't happening in many of those churches. There are good things happening. So again, to be critical is difficult. I don't want to be. At the same time, have we settled for mediocrity rather than, and I'll call it so that I can specify at least a little bit without many hours of discussion, we'll call it biblical excellence. And biblical excellence would refer to virtue development. Okay. But have we sacrificed a desire to do good things? Okay, and you look at the In Search of Excellence, and there were a lot of companies, to be honest, as I initially started studying that stuff, that I considered excellent companies, and they didn't. And that was always perplexing to me for quite a while until I started to get some of the stuff they looked for. But the struggle with this discussion, and I apologize out front, is that in order to analyze and have the potential to eventually synthesize something better, okay, it sounds like we have to be critical. And it's
not in the sense of critical, negative attitude, but
Yeah.
critical in the sense of
and
thought.
yeah, and I don't want to be critical, because I will grant both educationally and in the church there's a lot of good stuff going on. I'm not trying to say we should dump it all.
Discerning, we must be discerning.
Yeah. And so now, how do we do that? What is the framework for this? Go ahead.
I feel like if all we're doing is to pursue excellence just for the sake of excellence, it's kind of empty to me. That's how I feel about it. It's kind of empty. And I tend to be a perfectionist. I'm having to constantly get rid of that idea, that I have to be perfect at something. Otherwise, I won't try. But if excellence just for the sake of excellence, and virtue and those things within excellence, which of course most public schools eschew now. They don't want anything to do with real virtue. But I feel like if my goal, and even as a Christian, or if I was educating someone or in education, that the real goal is to please God. And what does that mean, right? I mean, Scripture describes it, but sometimes we can look at Scripture and think, oh, well, you have to be perfect to do this stuff, to please God. But that's not it at all. So I feel like a lot of people have lost the idea of who God really is, how we can please Him, and some of the secular people, like secular companies, actually in a sense sort of are moving toward that kind of thing, even if they don't believe God is there or any, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to produce the virtues that Scripture describes, because that is the way to do it. Those are the laws of nature. When you do
It's
those things.
just a little footnote on this. This is from very long ago, but again, for leadership research, Peter Drucker for a long time was the guru of management thinking. He's still, and his books are still very good, but it still shows how old I am. You probably may not have even ever heard of him. But in reading what I call the Big Fat Management book, which was a book like this fat, which was just a top series of topics on management by Drucker, one thing just jumped out at me one day I was reading through, because he's really interesting. I could get off on tangents. I actually got to hear him speak one time, and that was an experience in a lot of ways. One, it was really hard to follow, but anyway, it was. He's basically reasoned his way to the point that excellent management is going to be produced by virtuous managers. So this is not a Christian book, but that's what he said. He said, my only problem is I don't know how to build virtue. And I mean, that just jumped out at me like, whoa, there it is. There is somebody who really understands what it means to manage or to lead, and gets that the key characteristic is development of virtue. And that is what Christianity is about. And yet we don't emphasize that. We don't get the role that plays. And or another way of coming at this, you could look at a lot of schools, both public and private, and they have excellent goals. But they're not achieving excellent results. And some of them are actually pretty good. And you have to just keep asking yourself, why? And that's what I'm doing today. Today will feel probably very uncomfortable, and again,
Oh, no, this
apologize.
is fun.
Because there won't necessarily be answers. Maybe we'll get there, but it's more a matter of if we're going to look at in education and the church what we can do to make a difference, to have an effect on the world for Jesus Christ.
Right.
We've got to ask some questions and do some things differently, because the same old thing that's been going on for decades and centuries isn't producing a result right now.
Mhm.
And we just have to at least ask the questions. It may be radically different, it may not be radically different, but there's something we're missing, and that's what I'm trying to get us to probe at. Eliana, it's been up for a while.
Her hand up before.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
To me, for the church, when you think of excellence, there's two things. There's two main key factors that I see in us being mediocre, and that is there is no discipleship in the churches anymore. And I think a big part of that is because the mega churches that are everywhere can become the envy of pastors. Look how many thousands of members they have. This pastor must be excellent. He must really, really be good. And so because we are human and in the flesh, desires begin to arise. And so the focus has shifted for a lot of churches on that. I want to, a measure of excellence and success is the size, the nickels, noses, and numbers in the church. And then what you have, because there's no discipleship, one, and because individual people are not spending time in the Word, they have not learned to develop a relationship with the Lord through reading the Word and letting that speak to them and shape them. We're so, you hear all the time, I hear all the time, oh, I'm just so busy. Yes, I should, read the Word, but I'm just so busy. Well, everybody has the same 24 hours in a day. I was a single mother of 9 children, and the Word was my number one priority, so that as a single mom, the ship went down, the children went down with me, and that was my grounding. That was my lifesaver. And so you've got that going on in our society and in other countries in the world. But then what we need is to put our focus on for excellence in the church is discipleship. When someone comes to the Lord as a newborn Christian, they're just counted too often as nickel, nose, and number, Yay, we've added to our flock. Look how successful we are. Look how great we are. Look how big we are. We must be doing something right. But the people inside are starving. They're starving. They're less than mediocre because they have not developed themselves personally or been discipled to develop a love for the Word, because the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, So to me, that's, and it sounds simple and basic and foundational, but it needs to happen. And we can be a small congregation and be excellent because we are walking in the Word.
It is.
We are serving the Lord and each other and doing the first 2 commandments.
One, I think there's much we can draw from what you're saying. We might have to add or adjust meanings of words or equate words, but there's much of what we can say. And just to plant the thought, to keep thinking about it, is the idea of size, has it gotten in our way to keep us from thinking about what's really important? And I'll use an example which is probably more personal than I normally do, but one of the most common things for most of the time that I was at Apple Valley was, as I either worked on a team for accreditation, or as I got to know people, or as I talked to people in the valley, and so on and so forth, people were always wanting to raid me to go do something else. And most of the time it wasn't tempting. Every once in a while it was. One of those 2 schools that was excellent, that I was on the accreditation team, had a position open that was exactly what I was doing at Apple Valley. And that I was tempted for more than a few minutes. One of the conclusions I came to was, first of all, most important, it's not about me. Okay, I need to remind myself of that constantly. And secondly, if I went to do any one of these other things, they would be such a distraction from what I think is really important that I would never work on what's really important. And what Little Dinky Apple Valley Christian allowed me to do was to keep working on what I thought was important, and keep making mistakes, and keep learning, and keep work, and have the opportunity to work with kids and who taught me much. To the point now that as I start to reflect on all of these things, one of the hazards of getting old is I'm starting to wonder if size is almost a barrier here. Just so you get sort of an idea of what I have in mind, and then you can be thinking about it. Because we equate excellence with certain characteristics, that's why public schools are developed the way they are. Okay, so they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's more efficient, at times it is. Okay, more things you can do, more resources that you have, because bigness brings those things with it. Yet, the result that's coming out of it isn't particularly good. If we look at how could we do Christian education in a manner that was excellent, do we need to quit looking at the big, giant places? I mean, we can look at them and learn from them, but it doesn't mean we try to be them. What we need to be is small. And now next step is, if the issue is learning, and learning applies to schools and to churches, maybe there needs to be a working relationship between churches and schools. And rather than having a whole bunch of great big giant schools, and Texas I think demonstrates this wonderfully, if every one of these churches had a school, we could have the capacity of some of the public schools. Any one of the schools wouldn't be very big. Now in our minds we would then say they'd all be poor schools or mediocre schools. Well, they could be if no one thinks about it. But on the other hand, we could be excellent fast. It doesn't take decades to develop excellence in that kind of a sense. I know I'm rattling here a little bit, but I'm trying to get you to think of how we look at this a little differently, and maybe start to come up with some ideas that would be useful to us in the future. Eliana, go ahead.
Okay, I have a couple of things. First, I'm going to go back to it. You said, just like one particular point that you made, you said what you were talking about sounded basic or simple or foundational. His papers got wet. Sorry. And the thing is that it sounds that way because it is, but because it is that way, because it is basic, it's fundamental to building on everything else and really having excellence in church and learning and education. That's why it's such a big deal that it's not happening. That's why it needs to be pointed out. That was just a note I wanted to make on that. And then you said something about excellence and how pursuing excellence for excellence sake is kind of empty. And I would agree, but I don't even think it's possible to. I'm going to explain this. Hold on. Okay, going back a bit. If excellence is only achieved by being in accordance with what's true, and Christ is truth, then excellence is only possible by pleasing the Lord. It's only possible by obeying Him and walking in His commandments, and that can't be achieved without that. That's what like the entire book of Ecclesiastes is all about. Is all he says is that everything is vanity of vanities unless you are walking in the commandments of the Lord. Then and only then is there fulfillment in any of these other things. That those things aren't even achievable in any real sense, because reality, Christ and truth is not behind them. It's fake. It's air. Everything under the sun is nothing unless it's brought under heaven, unless it's brought under the rule and command of Christ. And another thing that I think is like that we're lied to about what real perfection is. I think that we get in our minds that perfection is some dot or point that we can achieve. And I think that that founding principle for perfection is false. Because everybody, there's a lot of, what's the word I'm thinking of? Whatever. There's a lot of going back and forth about, well, nobody can be perfect, et cetera, because nobody's this, like, and if you can't be perfect, then why would you go about it at all? But I think saying stuff like that is built on this idea that perfection is some point. And I don't think it is, because we're created as finite creatures. And I believe that perfection is a process. It's a progression of things. And because God is infinite, and if we're called to walk in accordance with Him, that's a walk for eternity. That's a walk forever. And no moment of that walk isn't perfection if we're in accordance with Christ. And perfection isn't something that you get to and then you stay there. It's not stagnant. We weren't created to be stagnant. We weren't created to be complacent or to stay in one place at all times, because we aren't infinite. We can't be in every place at every time. We're created to explore and enjoy the infinity of Christ. And if we weren't finite, we wouldn't be able to, I think, properly do that or explore, like have the enjoyment of goodness in a sense. Because that's what we were created to, was for the pursuit, for the chase of something better than us. And that's what excellence for excellence sake is about, is this chase and this walking along with Christ wherever He is in truth. I don't know if that's all I have to say. I think there's one other thing that had to go along with it. Like this little thingy.
On schools and churches achieving different results and striving to get there and coming up with different things as a consequence. It's like and you probably have heard a coach say this at some point or another. He says, people tell me it's not winning or losing, it's how you play the game. He says, don't believe it for a moment. Winning is everything. Just make sure you're playing the right game. You know, and a lot of churches have the wrong end game, and most schools have the wrong end game. And so they're accomplishing a lot of what they're setting out to do. They're just not doing what they should be doing. And I think that's the first question we need to ask as a church is, where do we really want, what's our goal? What did God make us to do and be? You know?
It was, see if I can try to put this into words, because it was an extended experience, but and it was something that students taught me. And the combination of that I'm stubborn and that I've been doing this a long time, it took a long time for students to teach this to me. Okay. I would get frustrated either that our school wasn't as good as it could have been, if we would have just had a little more resource, if we could have had a little more of this or a little more of that, or if I had done something better in the classroom, if I had had these materials, I could have done this thing, or whatever. And I'd have these discussions with students because I'd learned that they taught me a lot, learned that a long time ago. And one of the things that slowly emerged was learning happens better in the mess. You know, I liked an organized room, but it wasn't perfect. I didn't have all the materials I wish I would have had. I sometimes quite often thought of the thing that would have been really useful in class after class was over, not when it was happening. And I mean, all of these things. And as we would have discussions, particularly in philosophy, about these, and students would just work through it, they were slowly coming to a conclusion on their own, and I just watched it, and they were becoming convinced that what was being produced at our school was worth having to live with the fact that everybody looks at it like, you go where? And what do you do? And how many people do you have in your senior class? Good grief, I've got more people than that in my calculus class. You know, I mean, on and on and on and on and on. And not only did the students themselves had to come to grips with that, and they had to figure out how to describe it, because what was happening wasn't what happened in regular schools. You know, and I mean, we have various ways that we came at it, but we had the discussions about what's the nature of hard. You know, and there's an aspect of hard that is an AP class at a public high school is way harder than what we're doing. And yet I would get these wrinkled brow looks on the part of a number of students. They go, well, yeah, I have friends that do that, and man, they work all the time. I get that. But on the other hand, I don't ever see them thinking as hard as we're thinking right now. I don't see them doing the stuff that we do in class, and making yourself think it, and then try to do it, and then try to apply it and connect it to something else. I don't know what word you're supposed to use, but it sure feels hard to me. Okay, that would go. And they finally got to the point where they convinced me that I still wanted to make things better, but at the same time, really good things were happening in our mess. You know, at any given moment in time, I think it's the best way to describe it, was a mess. The politics that were going on over here, and the facility problems that were going on over here, and the parent problems that were going on over here, and all this stuff. And the thing that was wondrous in our classroom at that moment, and every day, there was learning happening.
My greatest spiritual growth and maturing period has been when I was a mess. Because it drives me into the word, you know. I've got to pick up grandchildren.
Yeah, go right ahead. Thanks for
See
coming.
y'all
Good to be
next
here.
week.
Bye.
And
See you Thursday.
Yes.
Good.
I guess it's these ideas to sort of cogitate on them, chew on them a bit. Now, how do we work them, these kinds of observations, together in such a way that that learning environments can be made good? And our two would be schools and churches. How can they be made to really produce good results? And I wish I had the answer. I think I have pieces of it, maybe. But it's more a matter of, and I think I used this example early on in the class, in the years that I went through the apologetics program at Biola, and in the early years, their main piece of that was what they called defending the faith. And so you could take it as part of the master's program or not part of the master's program, and it was superbly well done. 8 weeks, a break, 8 weeks, a break, and every speaker was some of the top people in the country, and they would have topics and go. And one of the times that J.P. Moreland spoke, and this was in the early, I think of the first year, because I was traveling home by myself After the first year, I always had students in the car, but first year was by myself. And for them, I was leaving Biola with a 2-hour drive home, starting at 11 o'clock, and I had to get up at 5 the next morning to teach. And I was thinking, one part of me was, you are totally crazy to be doing this. I'd overcome that one. But then the next one was, I have a giant headache, a really big one. Now, why? Because Moreland just made me think really hard, really hard. And my first conclusion was, you know what? I am not J.P. Moreland. I don't think I'll ever be J.P. Moreland. I'm not in his league. He's got more horsepower than I do. There's just no question about it. I just don't even have any hesitation. And yet, not only is he brilliant and amazingly good at communicating stuff, but he's just a very real person who lives what he says. And my next thought was, you know what? That's okay. Sort of going along the lines of what you were talking about. That's okay. Because just because I will never be him, that's not what God had for me in the first place. But what I got to see was it's possible. It's possible for someone dedicated enough, long enough, sticking their nose to the grindstone long enough to grow to be that kind of person. And therefore, okay, it's worth doing this crazy thing I'm doing. It's worth these things. It's worth it. And I don't know where I'm going to end up, but it's still worth doing. And it's encouraging. You don't have to get that. I didn't have to get that observation. But it was encouraging at the moment in time that I got it, that somebody's actually done it. It's possible to be done. It's not an impossible mission to do it. That in time, you can grow and put the pieces together. Now, is J.P. Moreland flawed? Yeah, he is. There's a number of areas that he is. But he is an amazing person that is great fun to talk to and brutal to have present. I mean, he can beat up on your brain in ways that I don't even come close to what he's able to do. And I think that sort of applies to what we're talking about here is we have to not buy the images of excellence that culture, the world has presented to us. We can grow. That's what we're supposed to do. And there is a direction that we grow in. It's not to be better than everybody else. It's not to be bigger. It's to be like Jesus Christ. And so we just keep growing in that manner. And don't be concerned about the mess. Don't be concerned about how big it gets. And really hard to learn, and I don't know if I'll ever get there completely. My poor wife hears quite routinely. God takes care of the birds and the flowers and all these things. He takes care of them. He'll take care of us. Okay, just because I made a decision that doesn't make a great deal of sense. Okay, God will take care of us. And really the discussions we have now is, she says, I've seen it. Don't always understand it, but I see it. God has taken care of us.
Yes.
And I think we have lost that in the church, and because schools have become their own independent entity, rather than being a component and outreach of the church itself, the schools then have gotten all hung up on themselves, and they have lost that. That God's going to take care of us. We don't have to be big. We don't have to be fancy. We don't have to be any of those things. But there's certain things we need to do, and if we don't do them, people aren't going to grow. Go ahead.
I've always, over the years, I've been saved a really long time. I've found that, or even now, just really letting it sink in, that faith is messy, and that's okay with the Lord, is as long as we are pursuing that excellence, that's what pleases Him. It doesn't matter how messy it gets, or how many times you stumble, how many times But we look at our stumbles, I think, and I often do, and go, oh my gosh, I really blew it, and blah, 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 and I get really upset with myself. But I don't think he is. I think he's just saying, just get up and, it's okay that you're messy.
Yeah.
And I have a hard time with that sometimes, and I think a lot of people do, a lot of churches, and also I was thinking too, going back to the educational thing, this equitable stuff, I think they believe they're being compassionate, but they don't understand that that kind of compassion is evil, and it will destroy people. And eventually, maybe if there's enough of those people who were raised in this equitable thing, will eventually try to destroy the excellent ones. Because they see that excellence and that virtue and they hate it, because they compare themselves to it and whatever, and never knowing that they could work toward that too. And that's,
And I
it's
think
so
that that's a
sad.
characteristic that we need to think about how we try to do it in the church, is there needs to be, all these words get different meanings in our time, and I don't mean them that way, but there needs to be a growth place. I was going to use the word safe place, but that got the wrong meaning right now. But a safe place to be messy, to learn, to engage in things, to be involved in those things. Because what has school become? It's become performance. Really, it's the grades, the team, the whatever, what people think of me, what my friends think of me, what the cool people think of me, all that kind of stuff. And we carry that right into the church. Those things are still part of us. It's a different environment, but we still think with those same ideas in our heads. And we apply the same kind of stuff here. And it's not safe to engage in a messy learning process. If I go back to my student example, that was one of the things I appreciated so much in working with them over the years, is that they weren't bothered by that. They were every once in a while, they would go, yeah, we are, nobody knows who we are in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the brown desert. But there was no way, when, sadly, the church that started us tried to close us down. Who were the people that stepped up to make it go, would not allow it, took us independent, and we did not miss a beat. Okay, it was alumni and the who were the hardest working people that worked themselves to death in the 2 or 3 weeks we had to change a business building into a school, was students. They were there every day, particularly seniors, because they weren't going to miss. They wanted it to keep going. They wanted to be there. They wanted to be there for that, and that has taught me a lot about it. Did they think they were producing a Taj Mahal? They were working in the mess. They knew it was messy. They thought it was kind of cool that it ended up looking like a school when we were done, but it barely. But that wasn't what they were trying to do. They just needed a place so we could do our thing in the classroom, so we could learn. That was all they were concerned about. They didn't concern what other people thought about it or any of that. And that's such a hard thing to learn. And I really appreciate that was something that high school students taught me. But anyway, other thoughts?
One thing I did learn too, the very first church I was in, where I became a Christian, I believed in God, but this place was extremely legalistic, which of course is not virtuous. It drove me about a year later to really study what is the grace of God. How can I really learn that? And even now, I still remember some of those things that happened in that place, which was more cult-like than Christian, versus churches today. And I can smell it a mile away now. But not that I want to. And I had to learn, don't condemn them for it. Let God take care of that part. But how can things be done better? How can you avoid those, those things? And use the grace of God in the right way. Because like I said, these people who teach equitable stuff maybe they think they're giving the grace of God to people, but they're really destroying people in a sense. Trying to really realize truly what is the grace of God, who really was Jesus. He did give some hard words and said some hard things, yet that was more compassionate than what these people that are teaching equitable are doing. He was trying to help them rise above where they were and to think toward truth and to think of, what true compassion is. And so it's been a tough learning process through all these years for me, but that's why I really do enjoy this.
Good.
Chuck.
I was thinking about learning the other day and trying to remember a time when I really learned something. And it occurred to me, I started programming computers like 50 years ago, and had programmed in, dozens of languages, and some I actually took courses on, and some I read books on, and some I did online training, and there are all sorts of ways to learn. And I was okay and, earned a living, but there was one language that I had to learn, and the only way to put it on the computer was to actually type it in from the source code. There was no media.
Gee whiz.
This was years ago. We didn't even have a paper tape with it on it, And so I literally had to type it in, and very little documentation, almost no comments. And I'm trying to think, what is going on here? Why is this way? And I typed it in, finally got it to come up and give me an okay, it was running. And I started playing with it, trying to break it and trying to do different ways of achieving the same results, and really made a mess of things, and came back and did it right and did this and that and that. And before it was over, I said, I understand this language. I know why he's doing what he's doing, how he's accomplishing it, but it was an ugly process.
Right.
And
That's a
there
good
were no
example.
shortcuts, and there was no one to ask. This was before the internet even, so you couldn't Google anything. But it took some work, and it was frustrating at times. I had to be willing to push at it.
Yeah, and to be frustrated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, before you do,
Yeah.
since actually we're winding up, I'm dying. You know how like when you somebody like Francis Schaeffer, for example, then you can actually trace people who his ideas influenced. C.S. Lewis, it's harder to trace because it's been so big and so ongoing.
Just put everybody.
Right. You know what I'm saying? But like you can often trace the circles that people run in and the people that they're sharing ideas with. So I got to look at. I was reading another book, started the other day, and I gotta see what this is. It's called Tactics. Have you heard of it?
Greg Koukl.
Yeah.
Someone here is influenced by Greg Koukl. I
Yeah.
think.
Right. So but I was listening to this. He goes, I was like, okay, does this sound like Moreland? Loving God with the mind is not a passive process. It is not enough to have sentimental religious thoughts. Rather, loving God mindfully involves coming to conclusions about God and His world based on revelation, observation, and careful reflection. What is the tool we use in our observations of the world that help us separate fact from fiction? That tool is reason, the ability to use our minds to sort through observations and draw accurate conclusions about the world. Rationality is one of the tools God has given us to acquire knowledge.
Yeah. And the background story with Koukl is, I won't go into all the details of it, but he had his master's in apologetics and had launched Stand to Reason, really, and was a lot of good things happening. And in fact, he was one of the speakers on this Defending the Faith. He would rotate through, so I heard him a number of times. After that, for being successful, being really good, I used a lot of his materials in the early years. I was trying to figure out how to do all this stuff in the classroom. He came to the conclusion that he needed to get better at exactly what you just read.
Mm-hmm.
And he went back and he could have done anything, but he went back to the master's program of J.P. Moreland.
See?
And he then trained. So instead of getting a doctorate, which he easily could have done, he got a second master's. Second master's way harder than the first one.
Yeah.
But because he needed to become even a more precise and careful thinker. And this was somebody that was already in a different league than most people. And yet that had reinforced in him, his work in the field had reinforced in him the need to even be better at that. And so he gobbled Moreland's stuff up. I mean, he in many ways is one of the better explainers of Moreland, and sometimes in Moreland is of himself. Yeah. Yeah.
See, that's interesting because I didn't know that background, and I'm reading through it and I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
they're clearly connected somehow.
The thing that's really interesting, you see the influence of Francis Schaeffer on so many
You
things.
do.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really obvious, and sometimes you have to have read a lot to see it. But the other chain is Dallas Willard,
Mm-hmm.
and Dallas Willard is one of the primary trainers of J.P. Moreland. And J.P. Moreland is one of the primary trainers of a whole group of people.
Mm.
Kokel's one of them, but just a wide range. And his goal, rather than go big, which they could have done, was to produce the best master's program in the country in philosophy and theology, so that he could send students out to go into the PhD programs in universities all over the country and take them over.
Mm. Nice.
And
Praise God.
that has happened
That's awesome.
in 20 years. And that is, it's a staggering achievement.
Mhm.
And just to continue the story, we had a student a number of years ago who was brilliant, particularly in math. Got an 800 as a junior in math on this SAT and all this stuff. And he got invited to be part of a program at UC Santa Barbara called Creative Studies. It was a unique math program. They recruited 16 people from the world to be in this program, and he got picked to be in it. And they were approaching math very differently. It was very kind of an amazing thing. And because they were so unique, they were allowed to fill in the rest of their schedule, because to the program, the rest of the stuff wasn't that important. To the university, they had to take some classes, but they didn't care what it was. And so as long as the head of the program signed it, you could get into any class you wanted to. So Adam Hopkins, this guy, he is a lawyer now. But anyway, he's poking around. You really had to know him to know this is exactly what he's just poking around. And he goes, my, there's some interesting sounding philosophy classes, and they're one of them. Secular, but one of the better philosophy programs around in California. And he said, but I don't want to take these classes. We already did that stuff in high school. I don't want to do that stuff. I want to take this one. This is where it gets really special. And then this one. So he goes to his advisor, and his advisor says, sure, if you want to try it, go ahead. So he goes in and gets to the class. And the first day he got there, and from then on, he said, this is amazing. This is such good stuff. And he ate it up, and then and now most people would have went and talked to the teacher right away, or the professor right away. Not Adam. He had to take a couple classes before he finally got brave enough to go do that. So he goes and he keeps taking these classes, and then he finally goes and talks to a couple different professors that were just amazing. And so he started talking to them and found out that both of them were from Moreland's program.
Oh my goodness, come on.
And they had gone to UC Santa Barbara,
Oh,
and
wow.
he stumbled into it. And so
Wow.
he ended up literally switching to be a philosophy major so he could take these guys as frequently as he could until they were gone.
Wow.
And one of them sort of took Adam, who you really had to understand him, but he advised him, how do you survive at UC Santa Barbara, which is one of the premier party schools in California? And he told him, here's how you do it. Don't live in the dorms. That's a disaster. Okay, live in an apartment, live downtown, get a real job so you're connected to real people. So he got a job at Starbucks and he became a manager by the time he was done in college. And you need to get to a good church. So he said, well, where's your church? Okay, I'm going to go to that church. Yay for him. He had enough sense to do that. And he came out and literally they were starting a brand new classical school in Santa Barbara. And he and they were only hiring masters and doctorate people for this school. And he almost got a position just out of his bachelor's degree. And he actually worked there as an assistant for almost a year, based on when he was teaching philosophy and logic and all of this stuff. So I mean, these little strands that grow out are so cool. But I always thought that was so amazing because it was exactly what Moreland was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And you just saw the pieces of it go all the way down to one of the students that I had a chance to work with. And
Interesting.
That's really cool, isn't it?
okay. Now we have a second article. We're not going to stay till 5 to do that, so don't worry. If you get a chance to read it, fine. If not, just bring it with you next time, and we'll launch there. Now you're going to see a different issue brought up here in this second article, and that is why are people leaving church? And yet they're not antagonistic to Christianity, and in fact some of them are quite active in Christian activity, but in parachurch organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we think about that? And again, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with everything the guy says in here, but I think he brings up some interesting points, and it's certainly a phenomenon that's going on a lot right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to look at that, sort of pick that one apart next time, and see what we can pull from that. And then our final thing will be, let's try to pull the main ideas of all of these couple brainstorming sessions together and see what we can put together and maybe combine it with the last chapter in Moreland's book as to some possible thoughts on what we can do for the future. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for coming.
It's great to know that there is a lot more going